Welcome to Must Reads Classics, a series of interviews sponsored by the Perkins Center for Preaching Excellence at SMU with authors of books that have, by virtue of their wide usage and influence over the years, earned the title of classics. Today, our topic is the 4 pages of the sermon, and my guest is the Reverend Dr. Paul Scott Wilson. Dr. Wilson is the Professor of Homiletics Emeritus from Emmanuel College at the University of Toronto. He has written really more books than we have time to list in this brief interview, but among them, The Practice of Preaching, Imagination of the Heart, God's Sense, and our focus today, the 4 pages of the sermon. So welcome, Dr. Wilson. So glad to have you with us today. And I noticed that I couldn't help but notice that I have had this book on my shelf since 1999, and I've used it in my own teaching and my own preaching, and appreciated it very much. And then there's a reissue in 2018 that we have before us today, updated, revised. So yeah. It seems like there's still a need for the book. And I'm wondering, usually people write books because they feel a need for them at the time. What was the impetus to your first writing this in the late 90s?
Well, I've been teaching for a couple of decades almost by then, and I was I found that my students often were doing excellent work in terms of biblical exegesis and engaging the contemporary situation, using narrative to communicate experience and so on. But oftentimes I left the sermons feeling quite empty. And it took me a while to realize that even though a sermon may be based on the Bible, it may not get to God. And the gospel, as I understand it, is God's saving help, particularly in Jesus Christ. And this was not being proclaimed in the sermon. So it came to me that going into the biblical text once and then applying it, which is the standard kind of bread and butter sermon, exegetical sermon, expository sermon through the ages, going into it once is almost always going to end up with the preacher telling us what we should do.
Right.
And what we should do is not the gospel.
Honey-do list, right?
That's right. Yes, it's a honey-do list. And it's important. It's important what we do. And ethics is a vital component of preaching. But God was missing. And the help that God is giving. So my basic suggestion that underlies the 4 pages of the sermon is that we need to go into the biblical text twice, at least. The first time looking for what is wrong with the human situation. What is the problem? What are people supposed to do? How are they sinning? How is the situation a broken one? And then go in a second time to see what the text says, the same text says about what God is doing by way of help. And of course, we want to connect that with the cross and resurrection. But
right. Well, after reading your book, when students preach in my class, my intro class, after every sermon, we ask first, who is God in the sermon? And if no one can think of anything, then we say, go back and read his book. So keeping God at the center, and I love this movement from trouble to grace, because it's not an easy problem. We've got a problem, God solves it. It's much more profound than that.
Yeah.
So it's one thing to tell people that they need to preach sermons that keep God at the center. It's another to give practical advice on how to do that. And one thing I really appreciate about the book is the way you alternate theological reflection with practical suggestions and actual sermons. So what is this tiny dog now is mine?
Oh, well,
Fred, take us through and keep God at the center.
I think the danger with the 4 pages can be that people start writing page 1, and then they go to 2, and then 3 and 4. And rather what I would suggest is that people start by identifying what God is doing in the text, which will be a sentence that governs page 3. And then page 4 follows. What God is doing in the text is what God is doing in our world. Once we've determined what God is doing in a text, then I think we can with greater confidence, identify what is wrong in the text, what is the trouble in the text, what is the sin or judgment, because God acts in a certain way in the text in response to that kind of situation. So what is the countering help that God gives?
Right.
So the tiny
start with page 3, really, right?
Yeah.
Start
yeah. So the tiny dog now is mine is one way of ensuring that the sermon has unity. Now, so starting with the sentence for page 3 is one of the ways of doing it. But the others are, this is an acronym. The is, take the capital letter T, one text, one theme, the tiny, dog, one doctrine, one teaching of the church that is coming out of this particular text, particularly the God focus that you might have in your sermon. The tiny dog now, one need. Can you think of one person who needs to hear what you're going to say about God today? Because if you can't, then there's probably no reason for you to say. The tiny dog now is one image, one dominant image, and mine. The tiny dog now is mine. One mission, one thing that you think that might be helpful for us to think about doing. Now, it's only by way of suggestion, because hopefully the Holy Spirit will act with the listeners and inspire them to a particular direction. But we need to be able to be sufficiently specific in our preaching that people have at least an idea of what it might look like to be empowered by God's saving help.
Point them in the direction. I like the metaphor that you quote about the tree that is nurtured by God. So the branches are what we do in response.
Yeah.
So one of the quotes I like is, you say, essay prose is ill-suited for preaching. It places high demands on the listener and excludes many with its jargon and abstractions. And as somebody that is interested in scene making and preaching myself, I appreciate your movie making kind of advice, because part of what you're concerned about is not just teaching, but inviting people into an experience. So could you give us like maybe the top 3 movie making suggestions?
I don't know. Let's see. I think the key thing is that people think best by seeing what is being talked about, and of course we can communicate without using a lot of imagery, and we use imagery all the time as any word that paints a picture. But as much as possible, we want to save the difficult language for the most difficult theological concepts in the sermon. We don't want to overpower them, and we want to invite them in. So first thing to do is establish where you are. Give us a picture. What's the location? Until you've given us the location as listeners, we can't follow what you're going to say about whatever action is happening. So it's giving us the pictures. It's presenting characters, particularly characters who speak. Quote the text, quote what words they say, or indeed what words they might say, given what the text is indicating. And third one.
Show, don't tell. How about that?
Show, don't tell. That's good. That's good
for everyone, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that's so helpful to break that down, because it seems like you're on a kind of mission, not only to put God in the sermon, but to invite people to experience God, not just concepts.
Yes. I'm sorry, we've got a dog.
Oh, that's okay. Is it a tiny dog?
It's a tiny dog, and she is mine, unfortunately, at this moment.
That was a good setup. Well, I wish that we could talk longer, but we are out of tiny time, and I want to thank you for this, for your work in general, and the influence that it continues to have on succeeding generations of preachers. So thank you, Wilson, and everyone that is not familiar with the 4 pages, go immediately and purchase it. And if you are, get it off your shelf and refresh your memory, because it's very helpful work. Thanks.
It's a real joy to speak with you, Alice. Bye for now.